Okay, so we are going to be looking at tourism in Bali. Bali is one of the islands, many islands of Indonesia. And we are hoping to understand the location of Bali, the appeal of Bali as a tourist destination, and to think about some of the impacts that tourism's had on Bali. So, traditionally, Bali is thought of as an island of peace and tranquility. You can see it's still very much very rural. People live off the land. You can see here some rice paddies. This is the volcano lake here. Mostly people have a very traditional way of life. Initially, the northern area you can see, look, not quite as suitable for tourism as it's very mountainous and volcanic. And it's quite a long way from the airport, which is down in this area. Okay. So that sort of the major areas that tourism developed were in the south of the island, on the coastline. You can see there Denpasar, which is the main city in Bali, where most of the tourism kind of developed around there. Okay, so the main settlements in Bali are shown on the map here. The blue ones slightly larger than the red ones. Okay, Kuta was formerly an agricultural and fishing village, but it became very popular. Initially, with tourism, you find that you have three kind of different sorts of tourists. The first set of tourists are the ones that are explorers and like to go to places that are very undeveloped and very off the beaten track, and they're quite adventurous tourists. The second lot that you get are people who like things with a little bit more infrastructure. They like to go to places where there is kind of decent hotels, maybe some international chains that they recognise, because that people are more comfortable with things that they know, those kind of tourists. And then finally, the last kind of group of tourists that you get are people that would literally just go to the same place every single year, would never go anywhere new, and they are like the least adventurous of all the tourists. So in the 70s, when people started first really coming to Bali, they were the very adventurous, more kind of backpackery, kind of looking for a bit of adventure, a bit of peace and quiet, and culturally something that was very, very different. As you can see, over time, the area around Denpasar has developed lots of different beach resorts, surfing resorts, surf schools, and lots of very kind of upscale resorts as well. So we refer to this area in the southern part of Bali as a tourist enclave. You might also hear this referred to as a honeypot, in terms of kind of tourism keywords, and that's somewhere that, because of all the different things that are going on there for tourists, the primary tourist things like the natural environment that's already there, and the secondary tourist facilities like the hotels, theme parks, all of that kind of stuff, it creates this kind of really attractive place for tourists to go. So it's either called a tourist enclave or a honeypot. If you wanted to avoid the really touristy areas, so get a little bit off the beaten track, then the north, around the volcanoes and the black sand beaches in Labina, are kind of more more where those adventurous tourists are more likely to go still. You can see here tourist arrivals from 1990 to 2000, so obviously it's quite old data, but you can see a very steep peak in the number of tourist arrivals. You can also see some variation. The Australian, if you look at the Australian little symbol here, there's a kind of an up and down of Australians. It's still very, very popular with Australia. It is the closest capital city to Perth, for example, so for Australians travelling, it makes culturally a very big difference, and it's easy and cheap for them to get to. Lots of tourists from Japan and Taiwan as well, really interested in doing all of the sort of surfing and diving and all that kind of stuff as well. So tourism developed very, very rapidly in Bali, and as Bali was kind of a less developed part of Indonesia, I guess it would be safe to say that it really struggled to deal with the influx of all of those people. Because Bali obviously was fairly undeveloped, people still worked in rural industries, lived off the land mainly. Tourism was a really good strategy for Indonesia to follow in terms of kind of attracting inward investment. It means that they don't necessarily just have to rely on one part of the economy, so it kind of broadens their economic base, and it means they haven't really got all their eggs in one basket, if that makes sense. It also helped them to get the money to build roads, to have water cleaning facilities, piped water, electricity, and all of those kind of things. And certainly in the last sort of 30 years, Bali in particular has seen a massive infrastructure growth. It used to take kind of 4 or 5 hours to get to the north of the island from the airport, but now you can get, well, it still takes about 3 hours to be fair, but it's a lot quicker and the roads are a lot better. Most places have electricity now. Obviously they've got a cellular phone network and all that kind of stuff as well. So hopefully you've had a little look at either Google Earth or the little virtual video, so you've had to think about why do tourists visit Bali already. The Indonesian people are very friendly and welcoming people, lots of traditional life, lots of temples to visit. It's still a very traditional culture, and it's very different for most people to go and visit and sort of see that way of life. The scenery is absolutely fantastic. The climate in the centre of the island is quite humid, quite hot and sweaty, but certainly around the coastal areas it's quite a lot cooler because you get the onshore, offshore breezes, and it is seasonal. In the sort of, I guess, around our winter holiday time, it does get quite wet and there's a bit of a monsoon situation going on. Hence, that's why it's so green and fertile. If you visit Bali, hopefully you would be lucky enough to see some of their processions or dances or temples. They're absolutely incredible. The Balinese dance is quite a fabulous thing to watch. Also, you might be interested. You might also be interested in listening to some gamelan music. Sounds a little bit like this. It's quite an unusual, interesting musical type. I'll leave it at that for you. You can make your own mind up on that one. Okay, so obviously the physical scenery of the island's really stunning. Loads of beautiful beaches. lots of very attractive scenery, which attracts lots and lots of people to the island. Some good facilities and hotels. All the massive hotel chains are in Bali now. Other natural attractions, it's a volcanic island. There's a monkey forest in Ubud. Very tropical kind of fruits, vegetables and animals to see. Kuta here, the main area we talked about before. It's a really pretty place. In terms of the impacts of tourism, basically because it's so desirable now, the land prices, foreigners aren't allowed to own land in Indonesia, but because there's been so much development from hotels, the land prices have risen dramatically, which has made it really difficult for local people to kind of get on the property ladder. Lots of building work, lots you can see here. Sometimes the pace has been quite slow, and because tourism's quite a volatile industry, as we can all tell at the moment with everything that's going on, it fluctuates up and down. So quite often people will start doing kind of construction work and then they run out of money and they won't be able to kind of carry it on. You've also seen quite a lot of deforestation and stuff like that in order to facilitate the tourism development. But it has brought with it kind of better infrastructure and a power supply and all of that kind of stuff. Cultural dilution is very much a factor of tourism when kind of cultures meet together. So people adopt parts of other cultures that they come into contact with. So that's obviously changed some of the culture and traditions in Bali. You might have noticed in one of the photos earlier there was like a picture of a McDonald's and stuff like that there, which is obviously not kind of the traditional way that the Balinese people would be eating. There are lots of more services, but because of that there's a lot of noise and air pollution and a build-up of rubbish as a result of tourism. Greater water use, and it's that kind of, because of the tourism, having swimming pools, having golf courses, all of these things use a lot of water and they're quite negative in terms of their environmental impacts. Lots and lots of air miles now from people visiting. Lots of good investment there, but you can see that some of the investment's been quite unregulated and it's just sort of happened quickly, caused a bit of a mess, all got a bit congested. The traffic around Denpasar is an absolute nightmare. Loads of scooters, loads of taxis. It's quite difficult to get around at busy times. People have obviously shifted from being employed in primary industry into service-based or tertiary industries, and obviously it's got a lot busier and there's a lot more rubbish. So in 2001, over 1.2 million visitors to Bali a year. In 2002, there was a terrorist attack in Bali, so things changed and got quite difficult. At this point, it would probably be a good idea to read the BBC article about the impact of terrorism and the Bali bombings.